So I'm here today at the Buddhist temple with my dear friend Lenny, and this is one of my favorite places to come to have peace, quietude, and practice meditation. But today we came here to talk to you guys about the connection between Eastern spirituality, the Buddha, the Hindu, Vedic teachings, and Filipino mysticism, which is an area that Lenny has spent a lot of time researching. Our story begins with Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, a young boy born into royalty in Nepal, nestled up next to the Himalayan mountains. Now, the Buddha's journey began when he decided to forsake all the worldly riches and power and wealth and sit under the Bodhi tree and meditate, living off a hemp seed a day, where he would discover the noble truths about consciousness, about our life, about our thoughts. So over here we have the Bodhisattvas, which not only were disciples of Buddha, but we also see Kuan Yin, who's the female counterpart of the Buddha. Of course, we also know that the Buddha encountered the Bodhisattvas, which were his disciples or followers. And through the teachings of Buddhism, we learn all sorts of ideas about our mind and how we are the custodians and the historians of our own actions, our own ideas, our own history, and how we make our life what it is. And up until the end of the Buddha's life, when he was dying, which we learn about in the Dharmapada, or the last great discourse, which gave us the chakras, by the way, he was giving us all sorts of different concepts and ideas, which we also know in Buddhism, these teachings would evolve into various metaphysical Buddhas. And some of these metaphysical Buddhas were General Kuan, the protector Buddha, who was a great protector and a warrior who would defend, against evil and protect goodness. We have the ideas of Kuan Yin, the female counterpart to the Buddha. Of course, there's the Buddha with 10,000 arms, the metaphysical Buddha, and the 10,000 arms reach out and hear all the prayers in the world into the heavens and answer everyone, giving peace and enlightenment and wisdom to all who seek it. And the heavenly guardians guard the Buddha, guard the heavens, and where we're headed. And then, most popularly, most of you have probably heard of the big fat jolly Buddha before, Maitreya. And Maitreya is the Buddha that's foretold to come. And it's not a physical incarnation of Buddha. It's the Buddha that comes to the world in the form of enlightenment in all of our minds and all of our ideas. But of course, another concept that you've probably seen before and heard of is the one of the swastika. Now you'll see that the swastika is on all the art. And everybody thinks this symbol is evil, and they associate it with the Nazis and the Third Reich and Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Is this symbol evil? What does it really mean?
This symbol has been used throughout Buddhism. It's actually a symbol for longevity, prosperity, good fortune. It symbolizes the wheel of Dharma turning, processions of cycles. But unfortunately, the Third Reich borrowed it for their own means, tilted it on an angle, and, but it's actually a very positive symbol that you should not mistake it for something evil.
We decided to leave the Buddhist temple early because it's very wet and rainy out. So now we're headed over to Banyan Books, one of Vancouver's largest metaphysical bookstores. So taking off from where we last left off, the story of the Buddha is a very important one. But, we can't really get into that story without looking at the Hindu teachings in the Vedas. At the time in India, when Buddha came along, we learn about the various Hindu gods that had been there. But these gods were said to have reincarnated into thousands of other gods. And there was all of a sudden in India, there not only were these great spiritual practices with meditation and prayer and awarenesses, but people started to blame all of their problems and ideas on all these various gods. So when the Buddha came along, the Buddha said, everything we are is the result of what we have thought. And started to see that suffering was because of attachment, and that it was associated with the mind. So those teachings were very important, but he was greatly inspired and influenced by these teachings, much like our scientists are. You know, you can go back and look at all the founders of quantum physics and the early sciences. I mean, I don't care who you look at. Niels Bohr, Erwin Schrödinger, Max Planck, Nikola Tesla, Albert Einstein, they all became Vedists, they all became vegetarians, because these ideas from the Vedas, these spiritual teachings, they were so profound, they were so incredible. They unlocked the secrets of the universe. They unlocked spirituality, because whoever these visitors that came to India were, they came down in flying vehicles. They were said to have come from other solar systems. Great temples were erected to them. And we know, if you look in the Vedic texts, you'll see that there's these vimanas, these flying machines that, you know, can literally take you, you know, up into the heavens. They had these wars fought with flying machines. It was really quite incredible what we learned and what came out of that. But what we also learn about the Hindu reign and this period, we can also see in something called the Precession of the Equinoxes. And what we see in the Precession of the Equinoxes is that every 26,000 years, our Earth goes through a cycle. And in this cycle, it experiences ages. Now, each of these ages lasts for 2,150 years. Some say 2,140 years, some say 2,160 years, but the general consensus is 2,150 years. So what happens is that our Earth is on an axile point, and it is turning for 2,150 years facing one of the constellations. So the Hindu reign, we know, for example, was during the Taurian age, through the sign of Taurus. And we see that symbolized all through ancient teachings. It's symbolized even in the Bible, of Moses coming down and seeing the Israelites. And of course, we know that they were worshiping a golden calf. So what happens? The golden calf was destroyed. And that was how things transitioned into Aries, which of course then we see the shofar horn. Now, you know, in that teaching, we also know that there are connections in the Bible to the Indian teachings. And some scholars will see the name Abraham and connect it to the Indian Brahmin or Brahma, and his wife Sarah to the Sarasvati River. Much like, you know, Lenny was talking about the Sanskrit word for the swastika being the Svati. So then what we start to see in other traditions, over in Mithraism, Mithra ripped the head of a bull off to symbolize the end of the Taurian age. We also have heard the expression before, holy cow. This is because the Hindu reign and the expression holy cow is connected to that, as well as over in Oxford University, that's where that relates to the age of Taurus. But this idea from the Precession of the Equinoxes continues on as well. Not only right now are we in the age of Pisces, but we know that Jesus, for example, ran across 2 fishermen. He multiplied 2 fish. The oldest Christian church in the world, found in Megiddo, Israel, has the fish on the floor mosaic. We know the Pope wears the fish ring. He has the hat of Dagon, Nimrod, the fish god. And we know, of course, that now we are moving towards the Age of Aquarius. And the Age of Aquarius is mentioned in the Bible because the whole Bible is based on astrotheology. The whole New Testament is an encoded document. And when Jesus is asked, where will you be at the last Passover? Where are you going to be, Master? He says in Luke 22:10 of the Bible, meet me at the house. And the house is an astrological term. Meet me at the house with the man with the water pitcher. And we know that Aquarius is the man with the water pitcher. Aquarius is always symbolized with the man with the water pitcher. So as we see this transition happen, there is a very important connection to what these great Hindu gods taught us and what comes out of the Vedic teachings and texts. And we know that they were beings that landed amongst us. We know they were beings with bluish-green skin. We know that they gave incredible things to humanity. When we look over to Indonesia, Burma, Myanmar, the archipelago regions, China, Thailand, all these areas, even the fabulous temples like Angkor Wat in Cambodia and the symbolism of 7. We learn that there's a connection to this ancient world, and the Philippines are no exception. So that's why this research that Lenny has done is so very important, because up until this point, Nobody has had an idea about Filipino mysticism. No one's known where the Filipino culture and spirituality originated from. And as Lenny's going to tell you guys today, there is a connection to all of this and who these great beings were. So Lenny, do you want to tell me about your research into Filipino mysticism?
Absolutely. Getting on the topic of Filipino mysticism, there's many things to consider. First off, the fact that Philippines was a very rich country steeped in all sorts of mysticisms. There's over 80 ways to say shaman because of all the different little tribes that kind of grew and refined their own way of shamanism. But in the end, there is still this intrinsic principle or property that gave way to all the shamanism, and that is Bathala. In fact, during the Spanish Revolution, when the Philippines freed themselves of Spain, a group of shamans, the Baybaylans, 2,000 strong, got together so they could fight the resistance. There were magical standoffs where they'd actually go against priests and perform miracles. I'm gonna talk to you about Bathala today. Bathala, going back into the Vedic scriptures, it relates to Batara, which means noble lord. They had many names for the divine being, one of them being Diwatas, which is also very similar to the word Devata, which means deities in the Hindu language.
Now, is it true that Bathala relates to Shiva?
Yeah, ultimately, they've actually traced little trinklets, little pieces of little totems that were Vishnu and Ganesh back in the Philippines, because the trade routes, Philippines was a culmination of all the Southeast Asian countries just stopping by. So they've kind of taken on some of the beliefs, business practices, and kind of blended in. So pretty much I did this sketch of Bathala.
So this is an illustration you did of Bathala.
Yeah, it's my interpretation. You see the masculine energy and the feminine uniting at the feet and their hair being tied together. That's a common Filipino symbology for union.
And you've told me before that the Bathala came to the Philippines, came down to the people, much like the stories of Shiva and the supreme deities.
Yeah,
came in a flying craft, some sort of flying whales.
Yeah, so they call it the Bukanawa, and these vessels were big enough to swallow moons, according to the Filipino people. There's excerpts from the Boxer Codex. This is a piece of literature that the Spanish made upon first landing in the Philippines, and they took accounts of their beliefs, the way they dressed, their business practices, but they spoke of these sky whales, loosely translates to that, who were covered in crystals, who made loud droning hums as they passed over the houses and stuff like that. So the connections between Viyamanas that we have in Vedic texts are it makes sense, it connects. It does seem like it can be related.
So do these beings, do they instruct the Filipino people into a tradition of mysticism? You mentioned shamans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a rich shamanic culture in the Philippines. Pretty much, there's, how do I say it, but there's shamans everywhere.
What is the word for shaman in Tagalog?
That's a thing. Tagalog is just one of the many dialects. It's the main dialect. There's over 80 ways to say shaman, but the most common one that they use is Baybaylan. So the movement of the shamans against the Spanish culture is called the Baybaylan Rebellion.
After Spanish colonization and Christendom came in, started wiping out these traditions and getting rid of them, have they survived today? Do the different tribes keep these traditions alive?
Absolutely. So I'm going to touch on that a little later, but pretty much the Filipino people have not forgotten. A few people have, but they've kept this culture alive and they've evolved it. They've gotten influences from older ones who've carried on the knowledge through the folklore of the people, and they're building up. There's this Trebmaka group, and they're combined of shamans from all over the Philippines coming together and doing rituals, finding out who they are, finding out which energetic circuits they run off of, and ultimately becoming better people and being reunited with their glorious past that they once knew. So ultimately moving forward and taking the gems from the past into a bright future.
Wow. What do we learn about this Bathala through the creation myth?
So through the creation myth, we learn that he was actually essentially from space before he came to Earth. So he eventually met up with
the orphan spirit, the sky serpent god, who then he had a battle with, and ultimately he won, slayed the serpent, and buried him in this spot. And time passed, and later on he met the wandering spirit, with this joyous, happy god, who then fell ill. And so Bathala, taking care of him in his state, one of his final requests was to be buried where the orphan spirit was buried. So Bathala followed his wishes, and when he passed away, he buried him in the exact same spot. And from that grew a coconut tree, one of them very iconic, it's very Filipino. So the coconut tree grew up, and it had the body of the snake god, and it had the wings of the wandering god. And then when he husked the coconut, he saw that it also had the face of the wandering spirit. And so from that, he decided what he needed to do. He needed to create people. So he created the people, and then they began to use the coconut trunk to build their homes. And then they used the coconut water to sustain themselves, and the flesh of the coconut to feed themselves, and they used the leaves from the coconut trees to build the rooftops and make straw mats out of, and all this stuff. The metaphor there is that no matter the energy or the original essence of what the tree sprouted from, like the negative being, they were able to make use of it, either for their homes to keep themselves dry and warm, or for food.
So can you tell me about the practices of Filipino shamans?
Yeah. So there was a system developed. You couldn't really speak to Bathala directly. You needed anitos, these spirits that served you. They can either be spirits of the dead, fairy spirits, spirits of plants, living things, but they ultimately led you to God, which is a very powerful metaphor right there. So anitos served as the messengers for Bathala, the ultimate being. So they would then, shamans were the only ones who were able to communicate with these anitos. They'd make offerings to the anitos so that they would then communicate whatever they wanted to Bathala. But in the shamanism, there was really intricate. There was also, you had to be baptized in certain elements. And I know these elements had ranks, like wind, baptized in wind, baptized by fire, baptized by earth, and then, and water, of course. But there was this final element. It, like, loosely translates to earth, but, like, the Filipino word for it is kaligtasan, which ultimately means salvation. It is very intricate how you translate these words, but it sort of means like continual saving, as in like salvation almost. But that also, like, it is the fifth element, which is spirit, is what I get from it. And there's also two types of baybaylans, two types of shamans. You're either a shaman of the living or a shaman of the heavens, and they each had their own expertise depending on what you were. But these things were naturally given to you. These things were naturally acquired, and in some of the smaller tribes in the Philippines, you would be tattooed based on what kind of shaman you were. So if you were a communicator with the dead, you'd have hexagons running up and down your arms. Really fascinating, like, patterns to determine what your job was. Ultimately, hunters had their own tattoos too. But ultimately, the influence that the shamans had on the Philippines was really great. They fought for agrarial rights, so they just fight for religious freedom. They fought for the people, ultimately, so they were allowed to grow, and like they wanted Spain to reassign the farmland, because when Spain ultimately came in, they took everything. They pretty much milked the land for what it was. You'd hear a different story though from the Spanish people. They say that they came to the Philippines and enriched their culture, gave them an economy which was completely, they had their own systems before anything came along. They had like intricate communities, structures, and they, like right now, if you were to go to the Philippines, in some of the parts of the Philippines actually have no hospitals, where healers are the main source of healing, like there's natural medicines. And that's just how it is in some places. Well, to prove the point that the Philippines had its own structure and security, and it didn't need that extra influence from Spain and the push of Catholicism, which brings me to the point that the Baybaylan movement, they're the ones who fought off Spain. Ultimately, they did their best to preserve what was there, and if it wasn't for them, we would have entirely lost the culture. So they had to preserve the martial arts style through dancing. They had to preserve the history through the folklore, which is like so rich today. They did all sorts of things just to keep the Philippines alive.
What about magic? I've heard that there's magical practices
vary. There's also records of magical creatures roaming the countrysides. Everything from, you go to the Philippines and the more remote parts with the hospitals, there are healers, an abundance of healers, but there are also witches, hexes, people who cast spells, people who do other things as magical creatures that you have to watch out for, apparently.
Now, because of the influence of Catholicism and Christendom, are the witches and the magic influenced in the way that voodoo and Santeria are by, Christendom with saints and whatnot?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Spanish actually used the word sorcery because these healers, these leaders, that's what their names translated into, were labeled to be witches. Their works, their miracles that they performed, because all the chronicles that were taken at that time were written by the Spaniards. They would say that all their powers were treated from demons, that they got these powers from the dark side of things, when ultimately they're tapping into the same source you would to perform any miracle. They refused to acknowledge that. They refused to validate the method in which they acted out these things.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, are there any superstitions about hauntings and graveyards and cemeteries there, in the ways that there are in some Caribbean countries?
Absolutely. Spirits are very much alive. There's a very rich ecosystem of spirits. Even as a kid growing up, I've been told about little elves, like things in the woods, certain monsters that'd be in the trees.
Tell us about the fairies and elves, because I know, Terence McKenna and others like Reverend Kirk have written books about elves and talked about fairies and whatnot.
Yeah, as far as I know, the word diwata, deity, translates loosely as fairy. So,
Wow.
like, if you're translating Filipino sites and you're reading like the stories, the folklore, it'll often turn that word into fairy. Often than not, when that's not a bad thing, because it actually can mean that. So it's just a broader term that they use, but like the possibility of fairies, like, definitely could have existed in that time.
What about spiritual practices, consciousness-based technologies, meditations, prayers, energies, rituals?
Yeah, the rituals are very important. Like, there's this lady, she's a healer in one of the like more remote towns where there aren't very many hospitals. What she'd do is she would say a prayer. See, the thing is with you guys have probably, I don't know if you have, but there's psychic surgery in the Philippines where people are able to like dig their fingers into you, pull out the ailments, like little bits of blood clots and whatever. But the thing was, since Christianity had a strong influence, most of these rituals begin with like this. They do that to begin because that's just the way it goes. But tapping into source can be done any way you want. So ultimately, one of the practices this lady does in this remote town is that she'll do the cross, and then afterwards she will get a glass of water, drop a pebble into it. It was probably something, that powers the pebble, and then she'd put a straw in the cup and then blow through the straw and hover it over your body, and the water would become murky as she passed through negative energy spots. And so she'd do this to you until the water like blew clean, and then she'd throw it out, and then you'd be healed. Every practices, certain things like that. But there are many. But ultimately, like, if you've read into voodoo, like, it's more of a creative act than anything. When you personally interact with the experience to draw out the power you need from the action. So rituals can definitely be customized, and there's a variety. Like I said, there's many different sub-tribes. There's like the main language in the Philippines, but there are different groups within that who had their own dialects, and they had their own practices and their own essences and their own way to call a shaman. But ultimately, just taking all that, and they all believed in this Bathala creature, and they all had like they all coexisted with each other in their own way, and they had like coming from the outside perspective, they must have had like a solid belief system, a structure to how they viewed the spirituality of things, how they tapped into energies that they needed to when they needed to.
What message do you have today for Filipino people that are in search of their roots, that are searching for the spiritual origins of their culture?
That there is a lot out there to uncover. Like, personally, learning about these roots, learning about the magical, glorious past that we had helped me understand who I was. Because essentially, when I was young, I'd have nearly out-of-body experiences. Like I'd be laying in bed completely paralyzed and the room would be spinning, and I didn't understand any of these things till I dug into spirituality. And now I like recently learned that Filipino culture was so immersed, was so intertwined with these type of concepts and ideas. It only made sense to think this way because, like most Filipinos, we have a Christian upbringing, and within that realm of knowledge, everything indigenous, everything rich that we once owned was mislabeled, was dashed down, was attributed to the work of demons, and they breathed fear into it. So naturally, you're out of touch. You don't know your full realm of capabilities unless you tap into, you look into, you read into, you feel these new ways of living. And then you can rediscover in yourself that there is much more that you haven't tapped into. Just like things like my dream life and stuff like that, it's like things make more sense. Intuitions, where to listen, how to listen, what you're listening to, and what it means. When you breathe in that belief system that there is this ecosystem of energy, of spirits, of intuition, and that everything is interconnected, because they taught oneness, much like many of the other ancient religions. Like indigenous cultures are very, very in tune with what was right. They're very natural, so they naturally contained all these principles. And I would just say it's definitely worth looking into, worth uncovering. There's revival groups, like thousands of people. Again, there are thousands of them doing this in the Philippines, but not so much in the Western world. So that's where we gotta bridge east to west and bring over these knowledge and use them for everyday life, pretty much. And like there's a wealth of knowledge to be uncovered, and I've just barely even skimmed the surface. So it's up to you to find your own truths.